So this week, I get to work on a fresh redesign of my church's website. I'm really excited about this project because I did a discovery session with our church's executive director. We did user profiles and user journeys for each of those profiles. And we discovered that the current website that's built in Squarespace, it really only targets visitors. So we have the opportunity to redo the website and really try to appeal to attenders and members and fold them more purposefully into the life of the church. This video could get pretty long, so instead, I'm going to break it up into several videos and do a series where we go through InVision Studio and look at the homepage design, and then I'm going to develop the homepage in Webflow and let you guys follow along as I do that. So let's jump into InVision Studio and look at the homepage design. Alright, so here we are in InVision Studio. If you don't know InVision, it's actually a brand new product, still in beta, and it's for designing user interfaces just like this one. I thought the New City East Lake would be a perfect guinea pig for the first time that I used InVision Studio. But anyways, in a minute, we're going to jump into Webflow and develop the hero section only, or the top part of the homepage design. And before we do that, I wanted to just go into the design itself and talk about how I tried to appeal to our different user profiles through the hero. In a future video, we'll jump down and talk about the rest of the website. The first thing I want to mention is the Give button at the top. So one of our user profiles was the regular attender or the committed member, and we discovered that a lot of folks, they don't even have checks anymore that they can write to be able to give during the Sunday worship service. A lot of folks have a need to give online. So I wanted to have a really easy way for people to log onto the website. They don't have to even open the menu. They just click on that one button and get to the PayPal donation page. But I definitely did not want to have it as the main call to action, because the website is not about asking for money. It's about getting people to engage with the church. And so I made it kind of secondary by moving it away from the middle of the website, putting it next to the hamburger icon. And instead of giving a color fill, just giving it a really slight white border. That way it's kind of secondary to everything else. In the middle, we have our H1 headline tag that has a description of the church. And then we have these two buttons. So usually with your hero section, you want to have one thing that you're calling people to do. The more you multiply that, the less powerful your call to action or your CTA becomes. But this is kind of a special circumstance where there's really these two profiles, the visitor and the attender or member, that we're trying to target equally. So I thought a neat way to do that would be to have two really colorful buttons that are sitting on top of a desaturated overlaid image. And then last, we have these two cards down here. When you click on those cards, it speed scrolls you down to the part of the homepage with that information on it. And I wanted to do this because I wanted to start changing people's perspective about the website and just give like a little hint that, hey, this is a new site and this is a resource that you can use. It's no longer just like a brochure website, but it's live, it's active, and it's constantly getting updated. All right, so that's the hero. Let's now get into Webflow and start developing the hero. All right, great. So here we are in Webflow. And before we jump into the designer to start developing the hero of New City East Lake's website, I just wanted to point out that here in the project settings on the fonts tab, I went ahead and added all of my Google fonts. And I wanted to point out one in particular, Zilla Slab. I'm using that as an alternate for Rockwell, which is the typeface that New City East Lake, the logo, is typeset in. And the reason for that is I don't personally own Rockwell. I thought I did, actually, and the church doesn't either. And so since I'm doing this project pro bono, and just to keep it simple, I'm just go ahead and using a Google free font that's pretty close match. So it's not too different. All right. The other thing I wanted to mention is I'll be jumping back and forth between Webflow and InVision Studio, just so that I can get kind of remind myself of how I wanted to position things. All right, so let's jump into the designer by clicking the designer button here. And here we are with a blank page. The first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and set up our section. Pull in a section div, and I'm going to call it hero section. One thing I like to do right away is go ahead and set up my HTML tags. So I'm going to name this header, and I just do that because it's really tough to remember to do that after the fact whenever you finish the project, to have to go back and do all of your HTML tags. And they're important for SEO reasons. If you don't know what SEO is, it stands for Search Engine Optimization. And it's basically the way that you get found by search engines. The more organized your website is, the easier it is for search engines like Google to crawl your website and figure out what content is in it, and then return your website as a result to somebody's search query. So it's pretty important, and that's why I like to go ahead and do that up front. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and style the hero section. I want to make sure that when somebody accesses the website, the hero with the background image is kind of full screen, full bleed, just to give that powerful first impression. The way that I do that is by using viewport. So I'm going to make the width 100 VW for viewport width and 100 VH for viewport height. And now the hero section is filling up this entire area. The next thing I'm going to do is add our background image and overlay. So I'm going to add the image here, choose image. I've already got my image set up, and you'll notice that it's currently tiling, and I can change that by making sure it is selected with cover and center, and make sure I click non-tile. You can change kind of like where the origin of the image is. Like if I wanted to make sure the top always shows up or the bottom, I could do that. Actually, you know what? I like bottom, so I'm going to leave bottom on. All right. The next thing I'm going to do is add my overlay. I've already got my colors set up. So I'm going to add my black. And if I move over to InVision Studio and double click to the overlay, you notice it's at 66% opacity. All right, so 66%. Wonderful, it's really coming together. Now that image is full bleed and it looks really good. All right, the next thing we're gonna do is add our navigation. I'm gonna scroll to the bottom, move that over. So just a word about this navbar. This is Webflow's kind of ready-made solution for navbars. You can go ahead and create your own, but I like to use it for different projects just because it makes some things easy. And really the things that it makes the easiest is kind of like the mobile solution for your navigation. So what I'm going to do is if I scroll over to InVision Studio, you'll notice that I'm using a hamburger icon that would open and close a hidden menu. And I'm doing that because with all of the content in my hero, I just felt like having the nav links would make it feel a little too cluttered. So I wanted to hide everything in the nav menu. And what I'm going to do is just go to the nav bar, click the settings, and down here in menu icon for tablet and below, I'm just going to move this to the left. And now my menu, my hamburger icon is going to be the default for everything from desktop and down. All right, next is I like to create my own containers. This is kind of like the ready-made container, but I like to control how responsive my websites are. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move everything out of this current container, and I'm going to add my own. Delete that. Bring over a div block, and I'm going to add everything into there. Perfect. All right, and then I'm going to call this nav container. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is if you look at the website, the navbar is actually sitting inside of the hero section, and I want it to actually be outside of the hero section, and you'll see why when we start bringing in our H1 tag and the cards at the bottom. But once I did that, once I brought it outside of the hero section, it pushed the hero section down. And that's because the hero section is respecting the spacing of the navbar. But we want the hero section to be full bleed. So the easy way we can take care of that is simply by making the positioning of the navbar. Oh, let me make sure it's selected. Oh, it is. Okay. Absolute. All right, so now you can see that the background image is now full bleed, but we want to make sure that our navbar is fully at the top. There we go. All right, and then everything, we didn't style our nav container, so let's do that. Generally for kind of responsiveness, you kind of have to like learn what your preferences are, but one kind of tried and true method is to set your width to 90% and your max to 1200 pixels. All right. And it's hard to tell because there's not a lot of elements inside the navbar yet, but everything is actually left aligned. So I'm going to hit the center element to move everything to the middle. Basically what it's doing is it's setting the left margin and the right margin to auto, just kind of saying I want to push as much as possible to the sides so that the elements inside of my container are center aligned. All right. Next, you'll notice that the navbar has kind of this default gray background. So we're just going to take that off. And as soon as I did that, I noticed that the hamburger icon is almost totally invisible now. That's because it's a black color sitting on top of this black overlay. So we're going to call this hamburger icon. And by changing the text color, I can actually change the color of the icon. Perfect. So now the icon is white. Next, I'm going to add the logo. Just a word about logos. I generally prefer to use SVGs for logos. SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphics, and that means that it's built on the mathematics of vectors instead of being built on pixels. And that means that no matter what screen you're on, what browser, it's going to appear crisp and clean and beautiful. So I'm going to bring in my New City East Lake SVG. And as soon as I do that, you're going to notice that there's actually nothing there. And that's because with SVGs, you have to set either a width or a height in order for it to show up. All right, so clicking on the image, I'm going to give it a class of New City East Lake logo. And I was actually very careful about how big I wanted the logo to be. And InVision Studio is telling me it's 54 pixels. All right, so 54 pixel height. And boom, there's our logo. All right, next, I want to add our give button. Before I do that, I'm going to be using Flexbox to organize the navbar. And so you'll see why in a second, but I'm going to add a div block to wrap everything except for the logo. All right, so menu button. And then I'm going to add a new button here. All right, wonderful. So what I mean is with the nav container, I'm going to make that into Flexbox, horizontal. I'm going to vertically align everything. And then this justify space between basically means that the elements within the wrapping container, the Flex parent, I'm going to push those to the side. So boom. The button, give button, and the nav menu are now where they should be, but the give button is not vertically aligned. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to call this navbar right, and we're going to flex this as well so that everything is vertically aligned. All right, wonderful. We're going to go ahead and give our button some styling, and I'm going to call it give button. And usually I don't like to create a bunch of different classes. So I would usually just call this button, and then any other buttons later on in the page, I would do a combo class or something just to make it easy to style other buttons in the future. But this is really the only time where a button like this is going to show up, so I think that's okay. All right, so what I'm going to do is let's see, gonna give it a border of 1 pixel white, and I know that it has a border radius of 2 pixels. And the reason I did that when I was designing it was because when everything is square and perfectly edged, it has this kind of like minimal or Swiss aesthetic, which can feel kind of like cool and editorial, but this is a church website, so I just wanted to feel a little softer and more friendly. So the 2 pixel corner radius, it's not super evident, but it's just kind of giving it a subtle soft edge. All right, and then it's got that blue background I want to get rid of. So I'm going to click transparent. And the next thing I'll do is pop over to InVision Studio and just make sure I'm getting the styling of the typography correct. So it's Poppins, semi-bold, size 14, with about 0.66 pixels of letter spacing and all caps. All right, let's take care of that. So all caps, oops, I'm in the hero section. So all caps, it is Poppins, semi-bold. It's got approximately 0.66 pixels spacing, and it says give. All right. One thing I found that font weights, the way that they're displayed in your design software, here in the browser of Webflow, and then finally when you publish it, the font weights, they kind of tend to change a little bit how they appear. So this is a little bold for my taste, even though it's exactly what's in the InVision Studio design. I'm just going to bring it down a little bit from semi-bold to maybe medium. Actually, normal looks pretty good. All right, and then it's still a little tight in terms of the letter spacing, a little difficult to read. I'm going to change that to 1 pixel. All right, perfect. And maybe another thing I'll do is increase the padding. So just a quick intro to padding and margin. Basically, padding is the spacing inside of your div, and margin is the spacing outside. So I'm wanting to increase the space between the edge of the word and the edge of the border. And so that's going to be padding. I'm going to change that to 24, and that looks much better. All right, and I'll go ahead and give it a hover state as well. So one thing to keep in mind is giving your user just some hints about how they can use the website. And typically hover states and turning the cursor to the pointer just gives the user a clue that, hey, this is something you can click. All right, so I'm just gonna want to invert the color of the button on hover. So I'm gonna change the text to white. Oops, sorry, to black on hover, and give it a background of white. Perfect. And then going back to the none state, I'm going to make sure that I give it a little bit of a transition. If I hover over it right now, the transition is instantaneous and it's just a little bit abrupt. So I want to give the background color some transition, and 200 milliseconds with ease is fine. And I'm going to give the font color the same. All right, so now when I hover over it, it's subtle, but it's just a little bit of a more eased transition, a little more pleasing to the eye. Okay, the last thing I'll do is the navbar is currently kind of jammed up to the top of the page. If I go over to InVision Studio, I notice there's some margin at the top. So if I click on the navbar, it'll tell me that's exactly 36 pixels away from the top of the page. And I like to be really exact with spacing, because when you use a spacing system, it gives your website some cohesion and it makes it feel like it's purposeful and well designed. So I'm kind of like purposeful down to the pixel. All right, so I'm going to move the entire navbar 36 pixels from the top. All right, so our navbar is now complete. Looks great, and we're going to move on to the middle of the page now with the heading and the 2 buttons. All right, so collapse all. All right, so next what I'm going to do is make the hero section a flexbox. I'm going to do that so that I can vertically align a div block that's going to hold all of my info. And I'm going to make a custom container. I'm going to call this container, just to keep it simple. And it's going to be the same thing, so 90% wide, maximum of 1200 pixels, and that should be good for now. All right, and then next, I'm going to add my heading tag. All right, so going back to SEO, another way that you can give search engines a better idea of the content in your page is by using heading tags appropriately. Heading tags are kind of like when you open the table of contents in a book, and just by looking at the different headings in the table of contents, you get an idea of the contents of the book. You're not reading the individual pages, but it just kind of gives you a little bit of a kind of like a sneak peek. And H1 is basically like the title of the book. This is how the search engine knows what the book is entirely about. There really should only be one H1 tag per page, and from there you go from H2 and down. All right, the next I'm going to do is all of the text, with the exception of the nav, those little cards down here, is going to be white. So instead of making every single element white, I'm just going to go and click on the hero section and make sure the text is white. And that went ahead and changed it for us. All right, and then next, let me copy over the text from InVision Studio. Perfect. And then one thing that I like to do is just to show you kind of the different options of how to style your heading tags is if I click on the selector field here, at the very bottom you can see I can click all H1 headings, and that means that when I style it here, if I inserted another H1 heading, it would have the same styles. So that sounds like it would be nice, but in my experience, there are times where I end up wanting to change the number of a heading. So it's probably not likely here, but let's say I want to change this from an H1 to an H2. Well, then all of a sudden I lost all of the styling because instead of attaching the styling to a particular class, I attached it to all H1 headings. So what I like to do is just click off of that. Just go ahead and create an H1 CSS class. And that means that even if I change this to H2 or H3, whatever it is, it's changing now, but even if I did that after I styled it, it would stay the same. It wouldn't lose the styling I gave it. All right, so currently it's in the wrong font. We're going to use our Rockwell alternate, which is, I believe, Zilla Slab, and it's entirely way too bold. So we're going to reduce this down to normal. And then over here in InVision Studio, we can see that it's a size of 48. All right, so 48. Perfect. All right. Another thing I'm going to do is I like using M's for the line height. It just kind of responds better in terms of responding to mobile or tablet. So instead of setting it to 56 like I had in InVision Studio, I'm going to set it to 1.125 M's. All right. So you'll notice that right away the space kind of increased between the lines, and I just kind of opened it up and made it a little bit more readable. The last thing I'll do is I don't like it when content spans this amount of length. Usually, content, you like to group it together into kind of a unit you can digest all at once. So when it's this wide, it's just a little bit not as digestible. It's harder to read. So you'll notice that in my InVision Studio design, it's constrained. And over here, you'll see I constrained to 787 pixels wide. I can do that by going to my H1 CSS class and giving it a max width of 767. Cool. I think it was actually 787, but yeah, it was 787. Let me change that. All right. One thing that I don't like is when you have a paragraph like this and there's just one little word hanging off on the end. So I might manually just kind of decrease this until there's at least in the Eastlake neighborhood. There we go. So 737 is a little bit better. All right. And then next, I'm going to go ahead and add my 2 buttons. And I will just go ahead and name this button. Just keep things simple. All right. And I pressed Command C and Command V to go ahead and duplicate the button. And all right. So you'll notice that over here in InDesign, there are actually 2 colors, but that's okay because we'll use the combo class to change this over to green once we're finished with all of the kind of general styling. So since I have my colors ready, I'm going to go ahead and change the background to that blue. All right. Here in InVision Studio, you notice that instead of using like padding to determine the size of the buttons are actually both the exact same size. I like that because Visit Us is shorter than Get Involved, but it still has the same visual weight. And that's really important in terms of reaching our user profiles and making sure that we're not trying to reach one demographic over the other. So let's see what we actually set the width to. We set it to 190. So in my button, I'm going to set the width to 190. And you see the text is actually left aligned. So if I center align that, looks perfect. And then I want to push this button over to the right a little bit so they're not sitting right next to each other. And again, I'm looking at my spacing. It's 24 pixels to the right. Let me use margin. Perfect. All right, looking pretty close. Let me go ahead and enter the text, Visit Us and Get Involved. And one quick thing about buttons is make your buttons just kind of as invitational as possible. I just really dislike using learn more as a CTA or as a call to action because it's very vague. And not only that, it makes the user feel like they have to do a lot of work once they press that button. So Visit Us and Get Involved are a little more friendly and less generic. All right, let's change the styling of the typography. Looks like it's Poppins, bold, 13, and 1 pixel of letter spacing, all caps. All right, let's see what that looks like. Poppins, 1 pixel of letter spacing, all caps, and I believe it was bold. All right. That's probably a little too bold for my taste. Again, even though it's exactly what's here in an InVision Studio, it's just a little too much. Also, I think this size might be wrong. Oh, yeah. Thanks, I left it at 14. So I'm going to bring this down and just figure out, I think normal probably looks pretty good. Closest to what I had in InVision Studio. All right. Another thing is the buttons are pressed up too close to the headline tag. So let me go back out and it's 40 pixels away from the headline. All right, so I'm going to add that to the top margin. All right, way better. Another thing I caught was there's actually a subtle drop shadow on the buttons. It's hard to see here in InVision because the background image is a little busier, but it just helps it to kind of pop off of the image a little bit and be more noticeable. All right, so we're gonna go into the button and just figure out what the stylings are. So the shadow is 20 pixels down from the button with a blur of 40, and it's a black at 20% opacity. All right, so scrolling down, we want to use drop shadow. Again, it's a black at 20% opacity. I believe 180 degrees is correct to make sure that when I set the distance, it goes down and not up. Distance was 20 pixels. So yeah, we're seeing the shadow right there. But once I increase the blur, it's gonna kind of smooth it out and make it less noticeable. All right, wonderful. I think the last thing for us to do, I'm just gonna double check, is change the color of the second button. All right, so I'm gonna add a combo class. I'm gonna call it green button. And, I did forget to do one thing. That's to give this a hover state. So I wanna give the hover state to kind of like the general button before I move on to the combo class button. Because if I do it to the combo class, it won't apply it to the main button. All right, so on hover, I want to change the background to this darker blue. And I want to give the transition of the background color some easing. All right, let's check that out. Perfect. All right, and if I switch over to my combo class button, I'll change the color to my green. All right, and on hover, I want it to change over to that darker green, and it's still retaining the easing that we set up from the original button. All right, we're getting really close. The last thing we need to do is the two cards down here. One note is that I'm actually going to use the CMS, the Content Management System in Webflow, to automatically populate the text in these boxes. But just for the sake of this video, I'm going to go ahead and input the text manually. All right, so we're going to start by adding a new div block. And you can see that when I entered it in, it pushed this content up because this content is respecting the space defined by this div block. But we don't want to do that. We want this info to be vertically aligned, and we want this div block to be kind of crushed down to the bottom. So the way to do that is we're going to make sure that the hero section, the position is set to relative. And that basically means that when I set this div block to absolute, it's referencing the parent element, any parent element that has relative first. So you'll see what I mean in a second. So we're going to call this like hero card container. Like I mentioned, I'm going to set the positioning to absolute. And down here, you'll see with the little target symbol, it's relative to the hero section because we made the hero absolute. And then I basically want to make sure that this is pulled down towards the bottom. So I can do that by making this 0. All right, and then we're going to do the same thing in terms of the responsiveness. We're going to make the width 1200 with a max of 1200 pixels. And we're going to center it in the middle. And right now you can't see it because there's nothing inside, so we'll give it an artificial height of 100 pixels. Oops, I misspelled that. All right, there it is. All right, wonderful. And then I'm also going to do the text align to right, and that's going to push all of our content to the right. All right, so next I'm going to enter in another div card, or block I should say, and call it hero card. I'm going to let the padding kind of determine the width for us, but I do know that the height I specifically set at approximately 80 pixels. Perfect. All right, so hero card, I'm going to set to 80 pixels. And currently it's the full width of the container because the the display setting is set to block. I want to change that to inline block, and that's going to move it over to the right. I'll give it an artificial width of 100 pixels for now, just so that we can see it. And maybe the other thing I'll do is, if I set this to Flexbox, move everything to the right and down, that's going to remove that little spacing that was at the bottom. All right. So our hero cards have kind of this 50% white behind it, so that the black text shows up a little more. So we're going to add a 50% transparent color. And then we're going to add some text. So like I said, I'm just going to enter it manually for now, instead of hooking it up to the CMS, but this is going to say latest sermon. And in a different text box, so I want to style it differently. I want this to say unity in the body. All right. So now that my card has some content in it, I'm going to get rid of this artificial width, and I'm going to set the padding to, I didn't set it in InVision Studio, so I think 18 looks pretty good. And then maybe the last thing I'll do is, I'm going to use padding to kind of push the content to the middle. Maybe something like 18 pixels. All right, that looks good. Now that I'm thinking about it, just trying to plan ahead for like, since this is going to be linked to the CMS, and so at any time somebody uploads a new sermon, this is going to change. And maybe the title of the sermon is going to be too big. So rather than setting the height, I'm just going to set the, it's basically going to be like a big button. All right, I like that. And then with hero card, I want to set the text to that black. And then we're going to style the individual text items. This I'm going to call eyebrow. And I call it eyebrow because in the same way that your eyebrow kind of sits above the eye and kind of accents it, an eyebrow in kind of a website or graphic design environment means that it's just kind of like this small piece of text that's accenting something that's larger. Let me go over to my card here, and oops. And you'll notice that it's Poppins medium 12-1. Okay. So eyebrow is Poppins medium 12, 1 pixel of letter spacing, and it is all caps. All right, yeah. I like the font weight, that looks pretty good. And then unity in the body. Unfortunately, this is in Rockwell, so we're going to use our alternate Zilla slab. This is set at 16 with just a little bit of letter spacing, and it's sentence case. All right, so we're going to call this hero card title. And it's going to be Zilla slab. I think I said it was 16. And just a little bit of letter spacing, and it's regular. All right, 125 pixels. Okay. That looks okay, but I want to give unity in the body just a little bit more emphasis. I feel like right now, latest sermon has more emphasis. So what I can do that is maybe try just a little bit of a bolder font weight, maybe increasing this to 18. All right, that looks much better. Okay. And then there's actually just a little bit, I think these are actually, there's like no padding or margin between these two, but here it feels like it's a little bit too close together. So I'm going to just push this up just a little bit, maybe 4 pixels. All right, great. Yeah, I like that a lot. All right, I'm going to go ahead and copy that and paste it. And now we have 2 cards. And maybe right away I noticed that in our InVision Studio design, there's kind of like this little bit of width. Let's distinguish the 2 cards. And that's 4 pixels. All right. So use margin to push this 4 pixels to the left. And I noticed that there was a corner radius at the top. And of course not at the bottom, because that would look strange. So the way you can do that is by setting the corner radius specifically to some of the corners. And now you see that. And I noticed, I don't think I did the corner radius to the button. So let me do that now. All right, perfect. All right, and then let me change the text here, latest letter. A Lenten series. All right, and I'm really glad with the decision that I made about using padding to determine the size of the card as opposed to setting a manual height or width, because it lets the card change. Oops, this is a colon. It lets the card change responding to whatever's inside of it. And the last thing I want to do with the card is make sure that people realize this is something they can click, right? So best 2 ways to do that are to change the cursor to pointer on hover, and then to give it a hover state. And what I'm going to do is just increase the opacity of the background so that it's at 100% on hover. Let's remember to give it a transition, background color, and that's fine. So now in hover, it gives you that nice transition. Currently is not showing you the pointer, and I believe that it will do that once we're in the preview mode or actually publish the site. All right, so I think we're done actually. Yeah, we are. That's all of our elements. Everything has a nice transition. Great, okay. Let's look at it in preview mode. There it is. Man, it's looking great. All right, and maybe the last thing we'll do is go ahead and publish the site to the Webflow subdomain. And I'll go ahead and link this in the comments. And I'll also link the Webflow preview URL. What that means is that you can actually access, hear what I'm looking at, kind of like the Webflow dashboard, where you can see, you can mess around with the settings and style it yourself. And it's in read mode only, so I won't save those changes, but it lets you kind of tinker with the back end of the website. All right, so I'm going to publish to selected domains. All right, and there's our website. Looks great. It's going to have this made in Webflow kind of sticker down here, unless you pay for hosting. And that's fine, because we'll do that later once this website goes live. But all of our transitions are working nicely. And you may notice what I mean. The typography just looks a tad different, but honestly, I still like it. I think with Give, I may make this just a little bit bolder because it's difficult to read with kind of the busy background behind it. So I may make this, change it from normal to medium, and increase this maybe to 1.25. All right. Let's see how that looks. All right, yeah, I like that a little better. Looks great. All right, we finished up the hero section of the New City East Lake website. Thanks for sticking through this video with me. I know it was kind of a long video. In the next video in the series, we'll be tackling the rest of the page. So make sure that you subscribe so that you can get alerted when that video gets uploaded, along with other videos that I do on branding and other subjects. So thanks again. Really appreciate you guys, and have a great day.